I'm Chris Terranova, and this is the Generational Exchange. 4 generations, one conversation. The business world is a tapestry woven from different threads. The experience of seasoned veterans, the tech-savvy energy of the younger generation, and everything in between. And this podcast will unravel those threads, exploring the unique perspectives from panelists in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s on today's business challenges. By bringing together these unique voices, we hope to spark new ideas, bridge the generation gap, and equip listeners with a well-rounded approach to navigating the ever-evolving business landscape. All right, we are back together for episode 9. We have the same crew that we always have. This is very exciting. I can't believe we are on our 9th episode already. It seems like we just started talking about this a little while ago. But for those of you listening, I will introduce the panel, starting with Jeremy Davidson, who is representing someone in their 40s. Good evening, my friend.
Hello, good sir. Hey, you know how I can tell we're in a group of guys here?
How's that?
Nobody noticed my haircut.
Oh, I noticed. I just
Ah,
didn't want to be that guy. I totally noticed. Listen, as a man who has no hair, I totally noticed.
I got one too. No one said anything.
Okay.
Mark, you got
we
one.
talked about this last week. Sometimes you just need to feel pretty, right?
That's right. You never want to be the ugly one at the dance. Speaking of, let's talk to Rhett Suchu, who's representing the 30s.
Thank you,
Rhett,
sir.
nice to see you.
Thank you. Not mad, just disappointed.
I think your hair looks lovely. And for
Thank
those
you.
of you
Wow.
who have access to the video, check it out. It's amazing. Both of them were
right.
cut.
That's
And we have Mark Russell, who's representing a man in his 60s. Is that better, Mark? Last time I said the 60s. Is the man in his 60s better?
Whatever it takes. So,
all right. Very good.
There's no spoiler alert.
And I'm Chris Terranova, and I'm representing someone in their 50s. So we have a great episode today. But if you remember, if you've been listening, last week's episode was about surviving the job search jungle. This week, we are talking about interviews. So if you're listening to this and you took our advice, congratulations, you did it. You might have landed an interview. But now what, right? You get that feeling. The stomach starts churning, the palms start sweating, and it doesn't matter if it's an in-person meeting or a video call where the internet might decide to take a vacation. Interviews can be brutal, no matter if you're a seasoned pro or you haven't dusted off your interview suit in years. But here's the thing, they don't have to be, right? Today on the Generational Exchange, we're here to share some of our battle-tested tips. And it's frankly the kind of stuff I wish I'd known on my first interview, or actually a lot of my interviews. We'll talk about what absolutely works, both for those face-to-face meetings and for the video calls that are becoming more and more popular these days. Both Jeremy and I have been through the process ourselves in the last few weeks and months. And so we'll be speaking from our recent experience, but the whole panel has had lots of experience interviewing and being interviewed. So I'm confident by the end of the episode, you'll be walking into an interview like a confidence machine, ready to charm the socks off of any hiring manager. So take a deep breath, grab a drink, and let's conquer those interview jitters together. So first up, the most important rule you need to remember, and this applies no matter what the format, and it will apply to all of our rules today, is preparation is your best friend. We're going to dive into how to research, look at the company, look at the role, talk about the interviews so that when you walk in, or more and more frequently, you log in, you'll be feeling like a total rock star. So with that, let's start the exchange. All right. So today's episode is about what to do and what not to do in a job interview. We're going to start with some things that you should do during a job interview. And I'm going to ask the panel to jump in as we go. We've got a great list. I feel very confident about this. The first thing, and Jeremy, I'm going to kind of look to you to maybe jump in first, is research and prepare, right? Learn about the company, the position, the people you'll be meeting with. Try to tailor your responses, if at all possible, to highlight the skills and experiences that are relevant to the job description. I'm going to just quickly throw in my experience. I very recently had an interview, and I spent about 3 hours researching the company, I looked at the articles that were associated with the company. I looked at the LinkedIn connections. They had a couple of videos, a couple of case studies. I watched it all and took notes. And it really helped me during the interview, because during the interview, the person that was interviewing me mentioned a case study that I read, and I was able to actually speak to it. It gave me a chance to clarify and ask some additional questions. And it really both showed that I had done my homework and that I was truly interested in what they were doing, right? I didn't want to go in and make it framed like I knew more than I did, because I had just read the article. It was just an article, but I do feel very confident that it helped me keep my candidacy open. Jeremy, I know you had some similar experiences with that. Can I kind of turn that to you next?
Oh yeah, 100%. I I actually really love that particular aspect of it. I think the most fun that I had in an interview process was, similar researching, going through, watching, and this particular company had a ton of YouTube video resources that were out there. And the CEO who I happened to be interviewing with was leading most of them. Whether they were shorts, whether they were longs, explaining the company, explaining the product, lots and lots of videos. And one, it provided her take on kind of the value add position of the company, which is phenomenal to have going into an interview. But two, as an icebreaker, when she joined, I mean, I got excited. I just looked right at the camera. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's so nice to meet you. It's like meeting a celebrity. I've been watching you on video all day. And, immediately that broke the ice, right? She's laughing, I'm laughing. And if you can figure out a way, and, not being prescriptive by any means, but if you can figure out a way to kind of lessen the weight of the room, from an interviewer perspective, we don't want to interview somebody that's super nervous, right? Like I'm looking to find the right person for the role. I'm looking to find you, and nervous you is not a good representation of you, right? So if you can figure out a way to kind of break the ice and get into the conversation, and maybe that research is a way into that. I'll put the serious hat on and say the real benefit to doing the research prior to jumping in, and whether that's going through the JDs, looking at all the other open JDs, looking at people that are in roles in the company, maybe previously in the roles in the company, is you might be able to determine why they're hiring for that role. Mm-hmm. Is it a high growth period for the company? Is it a replacement, a backfill position? Is it a brand new position? Sometimes they'll just tell you in the job description, but oftentimes you can kind of figure that out. And if you can work your way backwards to why they're hiring for that role, even if it's during your questions in your initial recruiter interviews, it's going to give you a direction on how to sell yourself, right? Mark, we talked about that last week, right? The interview, job searching, it's like a sales. You're trying to match your product, you, with the perfect fit, the employer. And your research is gonna be super, super critical to that.
Yeah. And especially when you're going to be interviewing, and candidly, you may be doing 2 or 3 interviews with that hiring manager. And so that whole preparation, taking notes, understanding what is it they said, and maybe even in the follow-up interview saying, there was something you said last week, I want to follow up on that. And those are the things that are really going to make the impressions. I know, the last team I got to hire, from scratch, once a few of them, once they knew I was a Gallup certified coach, they used that to their advantage, because they went out and they bought the assessment. So then they had something to speak to, and they knew that was a connection point to me. So it wasn't like, hey, okay, they were interested in it, but they really want this position because they're taking it to the next step and the next step. Because guess what? You're one of 150 people that are probably being screened, one of 10 people that will probably have that first HR interview, and then one of probably 4 or 5 people at least that you're interviewing, before you keep on narrowing it down to those last 2 candidates.
Right. That's a good point. Red, any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I'd say, obviously, I think you can hit this research from a couple different angles, right? Look at the website one to see what they're saying about themselves, right? And see what they say they stress on. Then look at what the employees that have worked for them before, have been saying, right? You go on Glassdoor and maybe the company website says, all we do is company culture. We're big on company culture. It's the biggest thing. And then you go to Glassdoor and everyone's saying their company culture is awful, right? Well, if they're hiring an onboarding manager, maybe one of the things you want to hit on is like, hey, one of the things at my previous job that I always focused on was making sure that everyone felt comfortable and energized to work, right? And you can build that into one of your answers or something, and they're not going to write that necessarily on the JD, like, we're looking for someone to fix our problem. But maybe you can identify some of the things that are going on that maybe, and we've seen this, right? That the person at the top may be giving one direction as far as where they want the company to go. But by the time it gets to the fifth or sixth manager, the message may start getting diluted. And then the people that are coming in entry level, they're not feeling that message at all. So
Right.
I think a lot of that will help. Looking at who you're interviewing with will, I think, help you a lot, right? If you're interviewing with the CEO, think about what they're thinking about in their day-to-day, right? They're maybe thinking about the entire company and which direction it's going. How much creativity do you have in the role that you're going with? How many ideas can you provide? Whereas if you're interviewing with maybe a third-party recruiter and it's the first interview, maybe it's more so about how many boxes can you check, right? How many of the, hey, preferred to haves should you mention and make sure that are in there and are up front so you can get to the next round. And yeah, I'd say those are my major ones.
Red, that's great. You found the elephant in the room. Yeah, I forgot to do that.
We always seem to have one.
There's
Right?
always
We found it so early today. I'm so excited.
Natural cue.
I think we could call that out because I don't think we have it in our list. I think the elephant in the room is not every interview at the same company is going to be the same, right? Know your audience. I don't think we have that on here.
That's a good point. It's a good point.
That's a great call out.
Okay, let's move forward to our next one. We're going to talk about interview styles next. And we're going to focus a little bit on the video interview, but we also have some for if you're doing it in person. But a couple of things, and then I'm going to get through the list, and then I'm going to ask you guys to kind of comment on the list as a whole, if that's okay. But especially if it's a video interview, check your tech, right? And practice. As silly as that sounds, and we've talked about this on earlier episodes, I found myself in meetings making faces. So when I started interviewing, I really had to watch. I know, right? I had to watch myself to make sure that I wasn't either over emoting or my wife calls this the Terra Nova scowl. I wasn't doing the Terra Nova scowl, right? So I did practice runs. I made sure that if they're using Microsoft Meeting, do I have that software? Do I need to download a WebEx package? Don't start downloading it at 9:59 when your interview is at 10 o'clock. Be ready and check and make sure it works if at all possible. Dress professionally and make sure your background is clear. It doesn't mean you have to wear a three-piece suit, but I think a backwards hat and a t-shirt is probably not appropriate for a meeting. And if at all possible, try to be in a quiet space. Make sure your Wi-Fi is good. It's well lit. You've got one of those little, selfie lights. Make sure you have that on. And then this is a harder one. I don't think we realize we're doing it, but try to maintain eye contact as much as possible. And this is a hard one to do. It's actually best if you try to look at the camera and not at the person in the eyes because you're kind of looking past them. Mark, I think you and I talked about one of those cameras that actually drops down and sits in the center. I've heard mixed reviews about that, but try to at least be focused on the person talking, right? I think that's important. And don't be multitasking. If you're going to be taking notes on a computer, let them know, hey, if you hear me typing, I'm taking notes. It's, you're not sending an email to your friends. And if you're writing and looking down, make sure they know you're taking notes. It's just good etiquette. And then something that actually I hadn't thought of is ask questions that leverage the video, right? If it's a video call, ask questions about, are they remote? What is their culture like when they're virtual? How do they collaborate if everybody is remote? And I thought that was a really good call out. For in-person, it's essentially the same things. However, you want to arrive a little bit early. You want to make sure you're dressed appropriately. You want to give a firm handshake, look them in the eye, smile, right? Make sure you don't have any broccoli in your teeth. Those kinds of things I think will really help. But the skills are essentially the same. It's engaging, being prepared, and looking appropriate. I will pause there. I will throw it out to the group for whoever wants to jump in.
Yeah, I think here the point I want to hit on is one that Jeremy hit on, right? Is not letting your nervous self take over, right? I think energy is very important that you bring to both of these types of meetings because you're trying to impress upon the interviewer, even if it's not the person that you will be working for, that, hey, you want to work with me, right? Like we get along. I'm flowing with what you're saying. I'm asking the right questions. I'm here. I'm engaged. And if they're not going to be your hiring manager, you want them going to your hiring manager and saying, hey, so and so was really into it. Like it's either they're too engaged, like they may want this job too bad, or like they're ready to go. Like they seem
Right.
like they're ready to start yesterday. And that's something that you can do through your attitude and the way that you're referencing topics and kind of your excitedness. So I know I'm kind of stealing Jeremy's point there from not being nervous, but I liked it.
No, excitedness though, and maybe that's, I don't know, what are you guys' thoughts? That might be even more critical in an online remote environment.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think it's really easy to slide into kind of the status quo. I'm on my computer, I'm multitasking, you know, and in that energy level. And I think if you can convey that well, that might even be more impactful in the remote virtual interview, right? Like if you can capture and engage somebody and hold their attention and get them smiling back and forth with you and laughing with you, like that's a unique skill. You can't, we always say that, right,
Right.
when we're interviewing, right? You can't teach that, right? Like
Yeah.
I can teach somebody my job. I can't teach them how to be excited about my job.
Yep.
So no, that I like your call out on that one. And Chris's call out on the tech too, because I've had that oh crap moment where it's like my stuff
I
is
have too. That's why I
loading.
remember it, right?
We
Yeah.
all have. That's
I
why.
thought it was Zoom and it's Microsoft.
Or WebEx. I haven't used WebEx in 100 years, and then all of a sudden it's like you have to download the packet and you have to install it, and you're like, oh, okay, great. Not the best. And even something small, I'll just toss this out. If you can, if you're on video and you can see my background, I have the skyline of Denver behind me, and I can't tell you how many people ask me what that is. And it's a good icebreaker. When I
Mm.
worked at my previous job, I was in a different part of my house and I had a photo wall and I had all these pictures behind me, and it always just kind of broke the ice, right? So just be thinking of those things if at all possible. I know not every situation aligns itself to that, but those little things, to Jeremy and Red's points, can make a difference as far as energy and getting the conversation started.
Yeah.
Mark, go
Yeah.
ahead,
Go
Red. I'm
ahead,
sorry.
Mark. No. Mark, go ahead. And then I have one more that I thought was interesting.
So my only point around smiling is put a little sticky pad note on your computer screen or on your computer next to the camera, just reminding you periodically, smile, relax, little helpful things that will really do that. And like you all said, the preparation with the video and everything, because if someone's looking down, they're not engaged. Now it's hard for me, like my camera's at the top of my screen. I have all four or three of you, the
Right.
four of us on the upper, 25% of the screen, just so I can try and, make that eye contact. Now, everyone may not have a second monitor at their home, but if you are using that second monitor, just be mindful and record yourself. Everyone can get a free Google Meet or whatever you happen to use as your email of choice. Record yourself for 5 minutes and
Right.
just be able to say, okay, how am I coming across? So go
Yeah,
ahead,
I have
Rick.
a MacBook. I even used iMovie and practiced. I've used FaceTime just to make sure that more or less the color is right. I don't even have to dial anybody. You can just see yourself on camera. Little stuff like making sure your camera doesn't have smudgies all over it. If you've got a cover, make sure your cover's, open so that they can see you. Because you never get a chance to make what is it, a second chance to make a first impression.
Yeah.
All of those things.
Yeah.
Okay,
The
go ahead.
Chris, one
Yeah,
one
yeah, go
more
ahead.
in here. It's funny because I don't think people think about this much, but have you ever had to dress down for an interview? Right. And I saw this point in here. It's, sometimes a full suit and tie is not what you want to walk into an interview with. And I actually had this when I had an interview. I was going over to work in Taiwan internationally, and I didn't necessarily look up what the attire was for the company. And so I got on there in a suit and tie, and they were like in polos. right? And the comment did get made at the end, like, hey, by the way, when you're working over here, it's 103 degrees and over 100% humidity. Like, you will not be wearing a suit. And I was like, got it. Absolutely. No problem. To show a bit of vulnerability there that it happened to me, but it's like, know what you're doing a little bit, right?
So-
It's a great point. Go ahead, Mark.
Well, so the only exception I would challenge back is I can always take my tie off.
That's
I can
true.
take my suit jacket off. It's very hard to find one and put one on if you don't come with it. So again, but maybe that may, for the first time, I think we're actually having that generational thing right now, because that's what I was brought up on and what I've always looked at
Right.
is it's easier to dress down than try and dress up if you're showing up not fully dressed up.
Yeah.
Well, I would always rather be a little more overdressed than underdressed, right? I mean, certainly that's easier. My recent interviews, I wore a sport coat and a shirt, a button-down shirt, right? I didn't wear a tie. I even had a corduroy jacket on one time, so it was a little more casual, but still, it still said here, I'm applying for an executive position. I want to look like I give a damn about the part, right? And I think there was an old saying that I grew up with, maybe with my generation, was always dress for the part you want, not for the job you have, right?
Yeah.
So take that into consideration. But again, just, be thoughtful about it. Just, not a logoed t-shirt or something, right? Just have a little respect for the position.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we spent enough time on that. Let's keep moving. One thing that I think is really important is making sure you know how to highlight your skills and accomplishments. Something that I had to learn, and Jeremy, you and I talked about this, was practicing talking about your career in a narrative style instead of reading your resume. Especially if you're a little longer in the tooth like Mark and I, you've got a fairly extensive career. How do you get through that, so that it's not a 45-minute dissertation about your career, right? So you need to practice that a little bit. Put that in a narrative style, and then use something called the STAR method, right? So the STAR method I've been using, I didn't know it actually had a title, which is exciting for me, but STAR stands for situation, task, action, and result. If you think of it that way, when you're structuring your answers, trying to showcase your skills, even thinking about your narrative, you can get through it a little bit more organically, but you're still hitting all the points. Mark, I know you've had some experience with the STAR method. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yes. So I think in some cases you may have the interviewer, like what I've always had, is somewhat of a rubric. If I ask a question and someone just gives me the direct answer, great. You get 1 point. If they come back and say, well, I had a very similar situation to this. This is what we were challenged with. This is what we resulted with and what I did. Now you got 3 points. And I even gave a 5th bonus point if someone turned around and said, now, if I were to do it again, this is what I learned from the last episode. So now this is what I'm going to, consider the next time. Because for me, it's a way of, did they understand the question? You even get a bonus point if you answer a question with a question, first, just to clarify. However, give what happened, give what the results were. But if someone really went as far as their own vulnerability to say, this is the lesson learned, then all of a sudden it's like, okay, this is separating 3 other people from this person, or this person is now separating themselves. Just since we're coming up to the Preakness next week, and we already had the Kentucky Derby, where Majestic Dan won by a nose. Well, I'm sure some horse would like to win by a couple of lengths. This is how you get those couple of lengths ahead of your competition for that interview.
It's a great point. Jay, you got any thoughts on this one?
I liked your call out about brevity, right? And understanding the role that you're applying for. We're applying for, executive director, department head, VP level roles. The quick background of how you ended up where you are. I was in customer success for the first 15 years of my career. Worked with some of the largest school districts across the country. Never made it to Hawaii. It's still on my bucket list. But that's what ultimately led me to my first leadership opportunity, which was boom. And I can go a little bit more in depth in that, right? Because I'm applying for leadership positions now. It doesn't make a lot of sense to spend much more than that 30 seconds on the first 15 years of my career, because it's not, other than the background and the experience that I bring with me to the role, it's not applicable to the position that I'm applying for. This one in particular, highlight your skills and accomplishments. I love that STAR method. That's the biggest thing I see. 90% of resumes are the bullet points under your work history, leadership experience, whatever you call that section, are basically a regurgitation of a job description, right?
Right.
Managed department budget, managed projects, came in on time and on budget, managed a team of 5, right? That's great. I could have done that. That could have been something Chris could have done it. Brad could have done that. Mark could have done it. What difference did Jeremy have in that role, right? Well, Jeremy managed the department budget and came in 22% under budget the last 3 years in a row, right? Like, that's impactful. So do you understand? Do your bullet points, not do you understand, do your bullet points showcase the fact that you know how your role impacted the company hopefully in a positive way, right? And I think if you can show that, you're already booming that top 5 or 10% of applicants, because it's a difficult skill to kind of master, right? To throw some stats and say, this is the impact I made. Specifically, I made. Nobody else could have done it. I made this impact. So I think this one's key. And it's a look for in our area, right? A lot of us lived in that customer success, that sales, customer operations world. And whether you're coming from that background or coming from the classroom or coming from a project management background, the ability to quantify your impact on something is critical to those roles. So for me, it was a bigger look for that somebody could understand what they did and the impact that had on the business than even what industry they were coming from.
Right. No, it's a great point. And actually, this is something you helped me with, because I was talking about the job, not the action, right? You actually helped me rewrite my resume because it's not how I thought. And you helped me with that, right? So I think a takeaway here too is don't be afraid to ask for help. Whether you've got one job on your resume or you have 100, if you're not sure how to write that out, ask somebody. Use AI now. There's all kinds of ways to get help. But I phoned a friend and Jeremy helped me with that. One other thing I'll add, and then we'll move on to the next point too, is if you've got anything unique in your background, I always call out that I'm a first generation learner, right? First one to go to college, first one to get a master's degree, first one to do it as an adult. I was 39 when I started my master's degree and had 2 little kids, right? I call some of those things out too, not in a braggadocious way, but to say I had a unique experience. And it may give you a connector to your interviewer that they may want to know more about that. It also may show some of your drive. So if you've got things like that, don't be afraid to call them out. Okay. Another one I think is really important is practicing your responses. And we've touched on this a little bit about getting your narrative right, getting all of those things done. But even though you can't predict every question, there are a lot of common interview questions, and you could go out and find a lot of the interview questions. Practice some of your answers, some of those basic ones like, why do you want to work here? How did you find the job? What's interesting about it? Those are interview 101. If you don't know the answer to that, or you're fumbling around because you haven't thought of it that way, it doesn't look as good, right? Practice, either like Mark said earlier, record yourself, try it in a mirror, do all of those things, because the more comfortable you are, the more confident you're going to come across. Brad, I'm going to start with you on this one.
Yeah. So for this one, what I tend to do is look at one of the first things I do, right, is look at the JD and what it's kind of mentioning or asking, right? What are the needs to have? What are the likes to have? And then from here, for example, if it says you'll be normally, presented with managing 20 plus employees. Okay, well, make sure you look back in your past and how you manage 20 plus employees. And then one of the first things I also do is most of the time, so the follow-up question to this is going to be, okay, well, tell me about a time it didn't go the way you thought. Type of thing, right? Tell me when managing 20 employees was tough and what you did about it. Okay. Yeah, I have a situation for that. Here's how it went. Here's how we took care of it. Here's what I would like to do better in the future, kind of like Mark's talking about. And then I'd ask Mark, how did you handle it in the past? Is there anything I can learn from you as far as how you guys tend to handle that as a company? Again, handling all 5 of those points if I can get them. But if there's a specific certification or something mentioned, right? If it talks a whole bunch about a PMP, make sure you review those classes and bring up the certain points and topics that are really important to it. And then one way that I think is really cool here, especially if you're on the final stages, right, and you're looking to really beat out the competition, is have someone try to build an actual interview for you, right? Give them the JD and say, hey, can you come up with some questions like that you would ask about this, even if you don't know the role, right? Hey, it says I have to manage 20 employees. Like, can you just ask me a bunch of questions about managing 20 employees and I'll try to get through them, and have your rough sessions with your friends and practice and then be ready for the real one.
That's a great point. Really, really good point. Jeremy, Mark, any thoughts on that one?
I'll just quickly say two things. Number one, former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, who's also an accomplished a classical pianist. She said that she had to know her piece is 180%, not 100%, not 110, but 180, because she said inevitably I was going to forget something. I was going to get lost. So even if I, quote, messed up 50%, I was still at 130. So I think that's one element. Second element is always be prepared for non-traditional questions. I would always ask people, tell me about a successful failure. Had nothing to do with the job, had nothing to do with, the preferred requirements or, definite qualifications, but just be prepared for some of those, because I guess on one hand, everyone said I was a tough interviewer, but I also asked I know, hard to believe. Unless it was a shotgun marriage, but we won't go down that path yet. But I think, again, it's just being prepared for some unique questions. And if you do get a question you get stumped on, give that pause. Give that, hey, I haven't heard that question forever for all my interviews. Give me a second to think about it. And then be able to try and be quick on your feet, but just don't blurt out anything, from that perspective. So,
right.
My only toss in there is try not to be too scripted. And I found this. I got to meet this incredible, lovely lady. I'm trying to remember where she was from. Georgia, maybe. Rwanda. And she was awesome. She was applying for SDR jobs, right? Sales development reps. And initially when we met, she was struggling to kind of put together her thoughts and her value proposition, right? So we wrote it all, we got it all written out. And then we found the issue was she was trying to stick super narrowly to what she had actually written. And if you guys have tried that, if you've tried to memorize a narrative on the screen, it's really hard to get off that and show any personality or think outside the box, right? So then we had I actually looked at her one day. I said, I need you to put down the note cards. We're talking about you. You're the expert on you. Nobody knows you better than you, even me, because I've heard this script like 15 times now, but you still know it better than I do.
That's awesome.
Tell me who you are, right? And so that would be my only caution. I love the idea of scripting out. Mark probably wishes I did it a little bit more because it would keep me a little bit more on task with the answers here. But try to let some of your personality show through.
They're all great points. You guys have really touched on some good things. I mean, one of my favorite kind of, not a gotcha question, but was an off script question to your point, was how would your best friend describe you? Right. And that always kind of stopped people to think about, kind of, I know how I describe myself, but how would your best friend describe you? Another question I think you should be thinking about too, and this one actually stumped me the first time I heard it, was tell me something that you need to improve on. Right. And I had spent so much time focusing on all the wonderful things that I could do. I hadn't really stopped and thought about, well, what are the things that I could improve on? And I kind of bumbled my way through something about caring appropriately or some bullshit like that. And it wasn't a great answer. So I've had to learn to think about those things. Now, as I've gotten older, I really don't have anything I can improve on because I'm amazing. But you should always be prepared for that.
especially not humility. I mean, we don't
Right?
we don't need to practice that at all.
No,
No.
so humble.
No.
So humble.
Chris, one more here if you don't mind. Jeremy,
Sure,
we're gonna
show.
have to well, I'm just,
Get
figuring
in
to throw
there.
the
Get
in the
in
extra knowledge, for the people. Jeremy, we're gonna talk about this on one of the future podcasts, but that large interview process that we did for hiring that future manager for another region. I remember I was kind of the Simon Cowell on the interview who got to ask like the very mathematical, serious, big, like build out your proposition question. We're launching a new product. You don't have the team that's ready for it. What are you going to say to your manager? Go. And it was like, just the question was, it was built that you weren't necessarily like supposed to answer it right. Like there were certain things that we were looking for, but we were looking more so for your thought process. And are you prioritizing the right things? Are you thinking about budget? Are you thinking about bandwidth? Are you thinking about timelines? Are you building a work back schedule kind of back, right? Do you have some of those pieces that we can't necessarily teach you or give you the tools to do? And I just, that question came up when Mark said, like, I'm not going to ask you the conventional question. We did.
It reminds me of one more question, then we'll move away from it, Rhett, that I think you got stumped on with me was I asked you, would you rather be good and on time or perfect and late?
Both.
I was going to bring that up. Have anybody gotten Chris's gotcha question?
Both. That was my first answer, I think, was both.
I said you have to pick one. You can't be both. What are you going to do?
Yeah, and then I picked one and I got the scowl. So then I tried to pick the other
one. You got
one.
the Terra Nova scowl. See, and
I tried to pick the other one, and you asked me why I picked that one. So yeah, that one really got me.
It was a trick question.
I know.
No,
it really isn't. I'd rather have you be good and on time than be late and perfect. So that's for me, good and on time was the winning answer. But let's keep moving. The last one on the things to do is, and again, this is a general list. There's probably thousands of things. There's probably people throwing stuff at their iPhone as they're listening, going, but what about this? These are the ones that we thought of. Ask engaging questions, right? Be prepared to ask questions back. Don't just be able to absorb the questions. This really does show that you're interested. You've done your research. You've prepped. Have questions ready. I think it was maybe a week ago, I posted some questions, and I'm going to run through them really quick here in a second, on LinkedIn from Andrew Lokenauth from the financialnewsletter.com. They were great questions, and I'll post them in the description. I'll post a link to my to that post on LinkedIn in the podcast. And these questions aren't just for folks that are new to interviewing or you haven't done it in a while. I literally just interviewed last week, and I used most of these questions, and I can tell you that they increased my chances of staying in the running on this because I got some very tactical feedback. Because sometimes you go through an interview and you don't know, did I do well? Did I not? Some of these questions really kind of bring some of that out to the surface, and they're kind of off-script questions for the interviewer. So let me run through these really quick. And then I'd love you guys to comment and maybe add some thoughts on this as well. The first question is there anything else I can elaborate on to ensure I'm the top choice? What doubts do you have about my qualifications for this role? I love that question, right? I thought it was really interesting.
Go ahead. That one. Oh gosh. My biggest fear about that one is that it gets them thinking about why you're not the best candidate. Do you love that one?
I did, and I asked it, and I got some very clear feedback that there weren't any doubts, right? No, we don't have doubts. Right? It was very good for me. It worked out great on my end, right? But I think again, you can paraphrase that in a way that you feel comfortable with. You don't have to ask every one of these questions, but I was at a place after an hour and a half where I thought, I'm going to throw that out there because I wanted to know. They might have doubts. That might be the fifth one they interviewed that day. Another one is, can you describe a typical day in this role? I think that's a great question. What skills and experience do you hope the ideal candidate has that we haven't gotten a chance to talk about? Again, that gives the interviewer a chance to engage back, right? How does the company handle internal promotions and career advancement, especially if you're trying to move up the ladder? I think that's a great question to ask. What key achievements would define success in the first 6 months, 12 months, 3 months? I actually asked that question and I got back, we want you to enjoy the role. Right? And I'm like, oh, okay. That kind of threw me off, right? So I'm like, okay, so I started asking culture questions then, but it got me going in that direction. And then the last one is, what are some soft skill must-haves that you feel would contribute most to success? And soft skills are more like empathy, talking, verbalization, things like that. I just thought these were really kind of just slightly left of center questions that, again, show that you're thinking. It doesn't mean don't write down all seven and ask all seven in every interview, kind of gauge your audience. But I just thought they were different and unique and might get you back some feedback. So guys, go ahead. I throw it to the floor here.
Yeah, I didn't mean to get in and squat all
Oh,
over
that's
you.
good. Hey, listen, this is not a diatribe. I want this to be a conversation. We're
The
not all going to agree. That's okay.
No, and I do like a lot of these, right? Because it gets people to scratch their heads in, and every now and then you hear real pearls like these ones. And I saw somebody on LinkedIn, a hiring manager on LinkedIn commented a couple weeks ago that he got one that blew his socks off. The candidate asked him, "What was the best piece of advice you ever gave a direct report?" And he said he caught him so off guard that he had to take a step back and pause. And um, so that's fun. I think these kind of bigger, broader, you get to the end of the conversation. Hey, do you have any additional questions? These are, I think, perfect opportunities to show big picture thought. Um, I like to, as you go through an interview, I like to kind of toss out questions about the role, about the team, about the culture. That could be more leading questions that might help you devise a response that kind of helps highlight your skill set, or again, kind of tease out why it is that they're hiring or what they're specifically looking for in a candidate. It could be something as benign. We love working for startups. A great question. Do you guys have playbooks for that already? Do you have metrics? Do you have KPIs? What are your look fors? Do you have customer journey maps? And know in any one of those areas is an opportunity to jump in and say, oh my gosh, let me tell you about this awesome one that we put together here, right?
Right.
So if you can figure out a way in the dynamic back and forth conversation, the best interviews are conversational, right?
100%.
To tease out some of that stuff that allows you to kind of take the answer and roll it into a big snowball and toss it back over and say, this is why I could rock out in that role. I think there's an opportunity there as you're going through the process. I got some thumbs up on the conversational tone. You guys like that one?
No, I think that's right. And I'll throw this little thing out there too, is a lot of times I'll ask, do you prefer questions at the end, or is it okay if I ask questions during the conversation? Again, you're not just sitting back and being passive. You're asking about how they want the meeting to run, because if they want to get through what they want to get through and ask all their questions, and you're kind of trying to throw your questions in, they may not appreciate that. But if, hey, to Jeremy's point, they want to have a conversation, you're kind of asking up front, what are the rules of engagement in this conversation? Rhett, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the question part of the interview is really critical for everyone. If you don't focus on it and you haven't been successful, maybe look into it a little bit more, because when as the interviewer, your questions are key to me, right? Everyone is getting basically the same questions from me because I have to keep it fair. I have to see your responses. You're going to give me different answers, and you may have one that sticks out more than the other. But, the best interviewers are all going to have an example of how they handled a situation, and there's going to be common themes. The question portion of the interview is where I open it up to you. You have full control to ask me a question, right? So what is it that you're going to ask me, like Jeremy has referenced here, that's going to blow my socks off? What if it's, if you're a bit of an expert in the region, I'll choose a simple one here, but, maybe ask about net promoter scores. Hey, do you guys use net promoter scores, and how has that been going? If they're like, oh, we haven't, you'd be like, oh man, well, that's a resource that I've really used in the past, and I've found it really beneficial for XYZ. And if they answer, yeah, we do use it, and this is how we use it, and you're like, oh my goodness, that's how I use it or have used it in the past, and this is how I found that it's really benefited, right? You can kind of set yourself up even more to show how great you are. So I really think the question part is big.
100%. Mark, any thoughts on that?
Well, I think one of the areas that you're doing here by asking these types of questions really speak to the organization. That said, if I'm reporting to Rhett, I want to talk to Rhett about what is your management style? How do you like to resolve conflict? How do you want to hold each other accountable? How do you want, how does the team, brainstorm and things from that perspective? What is the communication styles? What's the best way I can communicate with you? So it really tries to get it a little bit more to that a personal level. One of the other things that I've done is I've coached other, candidates looking for new roles. Spoiler alert, next week, we'll talk a little bit about a Gallup strengths assessment that's going to be offered to our listening audience, to one lucky winner. But at the same time, we have a phenomenal report that talks about the value you bring and the energizers you need. And as I've especially coached, Gen Z, Gen Y, feel free to say, these are the things that I need to be fueled every day. These are some of the things I need to be energized. And if you can fuel me and energize me, I'm going to run through that wall. I'll knock your socks off. So if you're not, comfortable enough to say, this is what I also need for the organization, and if you don't get the right answers, then maybe it's not the right role for you. But if you get the right answers, and again, any good manager is going to look and say, wow, I haven't heard that question from a candidate before. So in essence, just a couple of other, thoughts along the way as to how to really strengthen that question period back to, the hiring manager and or the interviewing group.
No, I think these are all great points, right? And again, I think it shows a kind of different perspectives of how to think about the interview. It isn't just about you, right? And to your point that if Red is my hiring manager, to ask their style. Again, kind of going back to my recent experience, the role that I was interviewing for actually is going to be taken from the person that was doing the interview. So one of the questions I asked, because I felt comfortable and we'd been talking for a while, is how easy are you going to let go of the role? You've got to build this. How are you going to be letting go, and how comfortable are you with me kind of, pulling it from you? And the person laughed and said, that's a great point. I haven't really thought about that, but let's talk through it. And then all of a sudden I started kind of helping build the transition, right? And because I think I was the only one that actually asked the question. So some of this you have to be a little bit brave on. But I think if you do that, it really will pay dividends. All right.
Please
go ahead.
They start chiming in at that point. They're like, well, you would do this. And I think the conversation's going really well if you get the interviewer talking about you in that role, right?
Right. They start visualizing you.
You would be doing this. And it's probably from a candidate perspective, you could jump in. Well, if it was me, if I was jumping into the team leading and heading up that initiative, or, because you're starting, visualizing, you're right. You're starting to kind of visualize that person in that role. And so if you hear that in an interview, that's a really positive. So I know we want to get to the things not to talk about, but I just want to ask you guys really quick, what's your good length? What's your ideal length for an interview?
That's a great question.
Both as a hiring manager and a candidate. Ooh, you get two.
Oh boy. Can we start with it depends?
Yeah. I think it depends on what level the converse, like where are you in the interview? If it's the first interview, usually I like to keep them short. I like to, especially if I have 10 people I have to interview, even if it's a really engaging conversation, I try to be thoughtful to the clock. So I would say 30 minutes on the first ones. As I narrow down the number of candidates, I would probably allow for more expansive time. And then for me, on the other side of it, the longer it goes, the more confident I am that I have a shot at the role because they're still talking to me, right? So I don't have a time limit on the other end. If I'm being interviewed, if I'm interviewing, I'd probably start and then work my way out.
Yeah.
I concur.
Okay. I would say I'd agree with Chris as the interviewer, especially depending on the role, you're kind of wanting to keep it to that 30 minutes. And that's why it's so important to show why you're the best candidate in that time frame, right? Keep an eye on that, make sure you're getting through your points. But as the interviewee, I want to be conscious of their time, right? But if we get going on a good conversation, I want to keep it going and go down the rabbit hole as far as, like you're saying, putting myself in the role and almost put it like, hey, we're solving this problem right now. And when you get off the interview, you're going to be like, oh, they could start doing that next week. And I have 5 more interviews. And so, as the interviewer, I'm almost like, I don't have a time limit. However much time you got, let's talk it out. Yeah, but I'd say like Chris, they tend to get longer as the list gets shorter.
Mark?
Let's go to the negatives because I've got 2 quick stories about the negatives. So, but I concur with the 30-minute, 45-minute, hour for the final candidates.
Jeremy, you brought it up. What about you?
Oh, even as a hiring manager, I don't feel like I really can crack through and get to know somebody in less than an hour. And
Wow.
Rhett knows it could easily be 2 hours. Like I love interviewing as a hiring manager. I
We love
really
talking.
enjoy it. Yeah.
No, that Jeremy, I just told you what I did to you. I kept you on the phone as long as possible.
That's right. That's right.
That's great.
I like Chris's answer. The longer they keep you on the phone, the better you feel about the interviews.
It's true, right? All right. So we're going to switch gears now. We're going to talk about some things not to do during a job interview. And honestly, these things are to me, they're so automatic. But I think you guys have looked at this list. We've all had people that have done this, and it just kind of blows my mind that we even have to bring these up, but just kind of be thinking about these things as we go through them. The first one is don't speak negatively about past employers, right? I think I said this on the last episode. You never know, the toes that you step on today might be attached to the ass you kiss tomorrow. You don't know who knows whom. Especially in the ed tech industry, invariably, we all know somebody that worked there, went over there. And if you have that connector and you're speaking bad about that, they might go walk over to that person and go, hey, what do you think about this? Right. So be thoughtful about that. It doesn't mean you have to do cartwheels about your past experience, but stick to your experience. Right. The next one, and we talked about this, about all the things to do, is being unprepared or unenthusiastic. Right. If you don't know about the job description, or you really haven't looked things up, or you appear uninterested, right? Even if you're nervous, that can be a red flag for interviewers, and I would probably not move you forward.
Mm.
And then the last one kind of ties into that, is don't appear unprofessional. Don't throw in a lot of slang. Please don't be chewing gum or eating or checking your phone or your watch or whatever you're doing. Kind of sit up straight and act like this is important to you, right? Because if it's not important to you, it's certainly not going to be important to me as the interviewer, right? So kind of as a collective group there, guys, what do you think about those? Anything you want to add? Mark, you said you had a couple of stories.
Yes. So the one would be use your best poker face. I interviewed in 2005 for a role, and within the first 5 minutes, the hiring manager looked and said, hey, I've got to stop this interview right now. And the look on my face must have been like, I can't believe I screwed up in less than 5 minutes. And he assured me, he said, no, this is a good thing. So-and-so is leaving to go back home to, out of state. And I want them to talk to you for at least 15, 20 minutes right now. So it became a very positive thing, because then I spoke to the gentleman. Mm-hmm. We did set up a follow-up conversation, and then the hiring manager came back in. We spoke for another 20 minutes. But again, it must have just been that initial look on my face, like, I can't believe I did this bad in just 5 minutes. But I was fortunate.
Your mouth swung open like a saloon door, right?
Exactly. But I was fortunate that I had a 9-year career at that organization, and forever grateful for that hiring manager to have been so impressed, I guess, in the first 5 minutes to say, no, I need this. I need my assistant director to speak to you real quickly before they hop in the car and go to the airport. So
did you get the job?
I did get the job.
There you go. See,
you know where that job was?
I do. And now that you say that, I do. But
yes.
What's your other story?
Oh, well, it was to the last question of never hire anyone that does not ask a single question.
That's our bonus. Don't read ahead. Don't.
Okay. I'll wait until the bonus question.
All right. Thank you. Brett,
Okay.
any thoughts on the things not to do?
Yeah, the I keyed in on the first one because we've all been in positions where you have to let people go, right? And sometimes you don't want to, it's not your decision, it's 5 levels up and you got to cut your team by 20%. And if I hear someone speaking negatively about another company, one of the things I might have in the back of my mind is, well, when you get cut, who are you going to speak negatively about? Us. We're next, right? So and again, that situation is not fun for anyone involved. And I totally get being upset about it, but you
Right.
want to speak well on the companies, So, anyways,
Watch those toes.
yeah.
Jeremy?
No, I went in after the bonus question.
All right. Well, everybody wants to get to the bonus. I was saving that one to the end. I was going to say this is for me. Clearly, this resonates with you guys. I will never hire anyone that doesn't ask me a question. And I can't tell you how many times I get to the end of a wonderful interview and they don't ask me anything. I'll be like, what questions do you have for me? Nope, you covered everything. Nothing, like nothing at all. How did I get my job? Why am I bald? Nothing, right? And it is something that has been ingrained in me over the course of my career, is that if you don't ask me one single question, it comes across as either you aren't interested or you aren't curious. And I don't want either one of those on my team, right? I want somebody who's curious. Always have a backup question, even if they're checking your questions off as we go. On my last interview, the person interviewing me probably knocked out about 80% of my questions while we were going through, but I came up with another half dozen while they were talking to me because I was listening and engaged, right? Always have questions. It is a huge pet peeve of mine, and I've hired hundreds of people and not hired hundreds of people because of that. All right, gentlemen, I know you're excited about this one. Get in there. Who wants to go?
Go, Jeremy.
Oh, yeah, I get to go first. No, I love this one. See, that's not as big. I like to do kind of that conversational interview. So I do tend to lend. Do you have any additional questions? But for me, one of my favorite at the end of the interview is, you've talked to the recruiter, you've talked to people on the team, you've talked to me now. Hopefully you understand the role of the company. Is this still a role that's right for you? Is this are you still interested in the role? And one time I had two people, and one of them went, I think so. And one of them looked right at the camera and said, "Oh my God, when can I start?" Right? Like, and that was
I would even take that, Jeremy, at that point, right? I would take that.
And that was the intangible for me, right? Like, there's just certain things you can't teach. One of my hard stops is, and again, typically I'm hiring for partner success, customer success, onboarding, implementation. Critical aspect of the role is the ability to develop, grow, nurture relationships. If they're not sending a quick follow-up email to the folks, I mean, I'm not even super offended if it's
Good
not
point.
me.
Yeah.
To the recruiter, to the people on my team that took time out of their day to meet with them. That's, again, if somebody comes into the process and they just intuitively know how to do that, that's something I know I don't have to teach them. They know how to manage relationships. So for me, that's my look.
That's a bonus there, is make sure to send a thank you. That's a good point.
My goodness.
Gracious. We're chock-a-block. I hope everybody has listened to the end of this podcast, because I mean it's just dripping with tips and tricks. Mark, what are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, he still wanted in on that bonus.
I know. I'm waiting. I'm ready to go.
Now, so the two things, especially if it's an in-person interview, I had a person who was one of my two finalists, and they interviewed with my boss, and they must have had a sense of false security that, well, I'm just talking that boss to be rubber stamped. And that person did not take one single note. And to my boss, that was the disqualifier.
Oh.
So that was story number one. Story number two is, and you guys have probably heard, when I was hiring for senior account executives or national account directors, literally they went through a gauntlet. They spoke to myself. They spoke to like 5 other peer departments. and those department heads. And then I wrapped everything up. And at the end of one interview, the candidate said, I asked, do you have any questions from the day? And they were like, no, I'm all questioned out. And I sat there and I said, okay, so now you've been on a campus, you've spoken to the provost, the CFO, the CIO, the vice president of online, and now you have your final 15 minutes with the president of the university, and you are all questioned out. Done. So needless to say, they were not offered the position.
And what Mark doesn't tell you is he also made them do the American Ninja Warrior course as well, and they had to finish in the time allotted or they were out.
I mean, that's pretty standard. That's but actually, Mark, that's a great point to one of our future episodes, which is going to be more towards companies as far as or hiring managers, how to build an interview, right? You have multiple stages, one stage, how long are they? What are the questions you ask? What are you looking for? Which I'm very excited about, obviously.
And if you subscribe to the podcast, you'll get it automatically as soon as we put it out there. All right, we're going to wrap this up. I'm going to get this summary out here. This has been a supersized episode. It's very exciting. All right, to recap, the things you need to do to succeed in your interview is prepare and do your research. If it's a video interview, check your tech, make sure you're dressed appropriately, check your background, maintain eye contact, and make sure you're in a noise-free space as much as possible. Ask questions that leverage the video. If it's in person, arrive early. Make sure, again, you're dressed appropriately, have a firm handshake. Look people in the eye. Don't forget to smile, right? Highlight your skills by practicing a narrative and using the STAR method to discuss your accomplishment. Practice your responses. Ask engaging questions. And I'm going to add a sixth one for Mr. Davidson is send a thank you, right? I think that's a great one that I should have included and I missed it. And then some things not to do is don't speak negatively about your employers or your past employer or even your current one, right? Especially if you have a job. Don't be unprepared and unenthusiastic. Don't appear unprofessional. And for God's sakes, never leave an interview without asking a question. Kills me. All right. Great episode. Lots of information. I mean, it is just packed in. This thing is just going to weigh a ton when we get this done because it's got so much goodness in it. Any final thoughts, guys, before we wrap it up?
Nope.
Good luck.
No.
All right.
Good luck in your interviews.
All right. Great conversation. As always, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Generational Exchange. We hope the conversation between these generations sparked some new ideas and helped you see the business world from fresh perspectives. Don't forget to subscribe for more insightful discussions across the generations. And if you have a burning question that you would like us to tackle, or maybe even a comment, leave it for us or shoot us an email at cmsrconsulting@gmail.com. And until next week, from all of us here at the Generational Exchange, thanks for listening and happy learning.